I did not stand when my wife introduced my replacement in my own ballroom. That was the first thing people noticed later, when they tried to reconstruct the evening. Not the crystal, not the quartet near the windows, not the river beyond the glass, black and slow beneath the Prague lights. They remembered that I stayed seated while Lena stood beneath the gold chandeliers in a dark green dress and smiled with the composure of a woman who believed the room already belonged to her. It had belonged to me for 31 years. The Hotel Aurelia was not inherited in the romantic sense. I did not receive it polished and profitable from a dead uncle with a portrait in the lobby. I received debt. Plumbing older than I was. Carpets that smelled of mildew and resignation. A kitchen staff that had stopped believing promises. My father called it a legacy. I called it a wound that had been left open too long. I was 27 when I took it over. Too young to look calm. Old enough to understand that no one was coming to save us. I rebuilt the place floor by floor. I mortgaged everything twice. I slept in room 204 for 8 months because I could not afford to heat my apartment and the hotel at the same time. I learned every pipe, every hinge, every supplier who lied with a straight face, and every guest who confused luxury with permission to be cruel. By the time the Aurelia became what people now called historic, elegant, and impossible to book in December, I had given it most of my back, half my hearing, and whatever uncomplicated version of myself existed before responsibility became a habit. Lena arrived 3 years into that fight. She was 24, I was 30. She came to interview for front desk manager and walked into the lobby in a navy coat with rain on her hair and a file of recommendations she did not need. Some people understand a room in one glance. She did. She saw the crack in the marble near the reception desk, the vase that was too small for the arrangement, the tiredness in the eyes of the porter, and she knew exactly what each thing meant. At the end of the interview, she said, "You don't have a hotel problem." I asked her what I had. "You have a trust problem," she said. "The guests don't trust that this place knows what it is yet." I hired her that afternoon. For years I told myself that I loved her because she had courage. Later, I understood that courage was only part of it. What I loved was her certainty. Lena made decisions the way other people breathed. No visible effort, no apology. She could step into a room full of donors, diplomats, and men who had spent their lives mistaking money for intelligence, and inside 10 minutes they were listening to her as if they had always intended to. When we married, some people said she was too beautiful for me. Some said I was too serious for her. We let them be wrong in whatever way they preferred. We had a daughter first, Clara, then a son, Daniel, 4 years later. We had 23 years together, if you count it by law, fewer if you count it honestly. There are marriages that break with noise, affairs exposed by lipstick, by messages left open, by neighbors who talk too much. That was never going to be mine. Ours failed the way expensive fabric tears. Quietly, then all at once you find the weak place. The weak place was not infidelity. Not at first. It was grief. Clara died at 17 on a wet road outside Brno in the passenger seat of a car driven by a boy who survived with a broken wrist and a talent for crying in front of cameras. There are details from that week I no longer trust. The color of the hospital walls. Who held whose hand? Whether Lena screamed when they told us, or simply folded inward like paper dropped near flame. But I remember this. After the funeral, I went back to work too soon because I did not know where else to put my body. Lena stayed home too long because she did not know how to leave it. We did not lose each other in one dramatic season. We lost each other by degrees. I took refuge in routine, in invoices, in repairs, in the physical obedience of old buildings. Lena took refuge in motion, fundraisers, curated events, cultural partnerships. She turned the Aurelia into something more than a hotel, a place where ministers drank next to curators and violinists stood where traveling salesmen once shouted into telephones. She made it beautiful in ways I never would have managed. The strange thing is that gratitude can hide distance very well. When someone remains useful to your life, you can go years without noticing they no longer belong to it. My brother Thomas belonged to it too. He was 6 years younger than me, and had been charming since childhood in the way that made adults forgive him before he had fully committed the offense. He never built anything. He entered finished rooms and rearranged the credit. That is an unkind sentence, but age has not made me kinder, only more precise. When our father died, Tomas received cash. I received the hotel. He said for years that this was fair. Then he said for years that it was not. Both statements came from the same place. I brought him into the business anyway. That is the part people always ask about, as if betrayal becomes less humiliating if you can identify the first stupid decision. Why did I trust him? Because he was my brother. Because blood remains persuasive long after it has earned the right not to be. Because after Clara died, Tomas knew how to make Lena laugh in a house that had forgotten the sound. Because Daniel admired him. Because on some exhausted level I mistook familiarity for safety. I made him operations director 12 years ago. He was good enough to matter and careless enough to ruin whatever he touched if no one watched him closely. So I watched him closely. For years, that seemed enough. Then, last autumn, I had surgery. Nothing dramatic, nothing fatal. A section of bowel removed after weeks of pain I had ignored in the manner of men who think endurance is character. The doctors spoke gently. Lena spoke sharply. Thomas volunteered to lighten the load. Daniel, now 31 and running a respected architectural practice, told me for the first time in his life that I looked old. I was out of the hotel for 6 weeks, not entirely. I still reviewed reports from home. I still took calls. But I was absent in the way ambitious people notice. That was when the signatures began. Not mine. Mine imitated. The first irregularity was small enough to be an error. A supplier contract rerouted through a development firm I had never heard of. Vltava Heritage Development. The amount was not alarming. The language was. There was a clause giving the company first refusal on future structural conversion opportunities. Hotels do not accidentally include language like that. I called our chief accountant, Ivana Horakova. She had worked for my father, then for me, and once slapped a wine distributor so hard in the loading bay that he apologized before his glasses stopped moving. She came to my office at home with a yellow folder and the expression of a woman who had spent 3 sleepless nights deciding whether to save my business or my dignity. "Tell me plainly," I said. She did. 3 vendor contracts had been shifted. 2 consulting invoices were false. A renovation feasibility study had been commissioned without board approval. More troubling than the money was the structure. It was too neat for theft. Theft is greedy. This was patient, layered, designed. Who authorized it? I asked. Ivana looked at the floor for half a second. The instructions came from Thomas, she said, but the signatures were presented as yours. I sat back and felt something inside me become very still. not rage. Rage is hot. This was colder than that. It was the moment a man stops hoping he is mistaken. I asked the obvious question last. Does Lena know? Ivana's silence answered before her mouth did. She attended one meeting, she said. Only one that I can confirm. But she did not look surprised. I thanked her. She cried. I did not. I had already entered the practical stage of pain, where tears feel like a luxury item misplaced during an emergency. That afternoon I called Petra Volk. Petra had once saved the Aurelia from a predatory lender by finding a technical defect in a contract written by men who thought their carelessness would be confused with power. She had the rare quality of making expensive people nervous. I trusted her almost as much as I mistrusted everyone else. She arrived after dark with a leather briefcase and the face of someone prepared to hear the worst. For the next 3 weeks, without informing my family, we opened everything: accounts, internal emails, property filings, board minutes, personal guarantees. We found the shell structure quickly. Vltava Heritage Development was owned through 2 holding entities registered in Cyprus and Brno, which would have been clever if cleverness were not so repetitive. The beneficial ownership trail led, by way of proxies and one insulting attempt at misdirection, to Thomas and to Lena's younger sister, Hannah, who had never held a meaningful investment in her life, but had recently discovered an enthusiasm for corporate paperwork. The plan, once visible, was almost elegant. Create pressure on the Aurelia's cash flow through diverted vendor contracts and inflated consulting fees. Commission a confidential valuation on the basis of structural inefficiencies. Encourage lenders to discuss refinancing against redevelopment potential. Present me as increasingly conservative, then increasingly tired, then increasingly unwell. Use Daniel's architecture firm to prepare concept drawings for a residential annex feasibility model, without telling him the model was for the conversion of the hotel itself. Position Vltava Heritage as the only buyer prepared to preserve legacy while taking over debt exposure. Push me into a board transition. Force a sale. I read it twice. Then I asked Petra the only question that mattered more than the hotel. And the personal part? She slid a second folder across the desk. I did not open it immediately. I already knew. Not because there had been lipstick on glasses or perfume on collars. Betrayal at our age is seldom so juvenile. I knew because once the business scheme was visible, the emotional geometry beneath it became obvious. People do not conspire like that from simple convenience. Not month after month. Not with that level of mutual risk. Still, evidence has its own cruelty. Keycard logs. Private dining room bookings changed at the last minute. A rented apartment on Kampa Island paid through the same legal proxy used in the shell company. Messages recovered from a hotel-issued phone Thomas had forgotten to wipe before replacing it. Most of them practical. Timing, pressure, signatures, lender calls. One of them not practical at all. He thinks his silence is strength. I read that line 5 times. It was from Lena. There was another sent 2 weeks later. Once the gala is done, it will be clean. Daniel will adjust. He always does. That one took longer. Not because of the business, because of our son. The centennial gala for the Aurelia had been Lena's idea. 100 years since the hotel opened under another name. Before war, before nationalization, before restitution, before me. A celebration of continuity, heritage, reinvention, 200 guests, press, donors, local officials, investment partners, Old staff, new money. The sort of evening on which institutions announce the future in language soft enough to sound like destiny. They were going to use my own anniversary party for the building to bury me inside it. Petra asked if I wanted to confront them privately. No, I said. She studied me for a moment. Why not? Because private betrayal becomes public truth only when the liar has no room left to edit it. Because I wanted Daniel to hear it from me before his mother and uncle turned me into a difficult old man with medical complications and emotional volatility. Because the Aurelia had fed 3 generations of families, and if it was going to watch my humiliation, it could at least be useful while doing it. But what I said was simpler. Because they planned it publicly. Petra nodded. She understood. What followed was not dramatic. Real revenge rarely is. It is paperwork, timing, witness placement, restraint. It is swallowing the impulse to strike too early because exposure without protection is only confession. While Tomas and Lena continued preparing the gala, I moved faster than they knew. I transferred my controlling shares into an irrevocable Employee Trust and Heritage Foundation structure Petra had drafted years earlier for estate planning, and I had postponed because I disliked thinking in terms of endings. The trust gave management authority to a supervisory board chaired, for the first 3 years, by Ivana and 2 outside trustees, one of whom had spent 20 years preserving old Prague buildings from men in expensive shoes. It prevented sale or conversion of the property without unanimous consent and city review. Daniel, if he wanted it later, could join the board, but not as owner in the dynastic sense Tomas assumed he deserved. The Aurelia would outlive us all, or it would deserve to die honestly. I also amended my will, not out of spite, out of clarity. Lena would be provided for within the law, but not rewarded beyond it. Tomas would receive nothing from me, which was still more dignity than he had earned. Daniel would inherit the apartment building on Yanachkovo Nabrzezhi, my personal investments, my books, my watches, and the old service ledger from the hotel's first years because he was the only one who had ever asked to read it. Then I met with Daniel. Not to tell him everything. Not yet. I needed one thing first. His drawings. He came to my office on a gray Tuesday with rain on his coat and the distracted tenderness adult children reserve for parents they fear have become fragile. He kissed my cheek, sat down, and said, "Mother told me you were overreacting about lenders." "She tells you many things," I said. He smiled despite himself. "That she does." I asked him what project Tomas had given his firm. Daniel described it carefully. A conceptual residential conversion model, not commissioned formally, only exploratory, intended to help attract strategic capital for modernization. He had assumed it was for an annex or one of our lesser properties. When I placed his own title pages in front of him beside the internal valuation map of the Aurelia, the color left his face in visible stages. "No," he said first, then quieter. "No." He looked up at me like a boy again. Not because he was weak, because betrayal reduces age very quickly. "Did you know?" he asked. "No." He stared at the papers for a long time. "Mother?" I did not answer. He understood the answer anyway. He left my office with the drawings under his arm and a look I had seen once before at Clara's funeral, when he realized that adults were not negotiating with pain, but losing to it. That night he called and said only this: "Do what you need to do. Just don't let them explain it to me first." I promised him I would not. The day of the gala arrived bright and cold. Prague in December can look cruel from a distance and tender from very close up. The river makes liars out of lights. Every reflection seems more honest than the thing creating it. By 6 o'clock, the lobby smelled of fir branches, wax, polished brass, and money. The quartet tuned near the winter garden. Photographers hovered with that predatory patience professionals call discretion. Staff moved in black uniforms like thought itself. I walked the service corridors before the guests arrived. Not out of nostalgia, out of habit. A hotel does not become trustworthy because its ballroom glitters. It becomes trustworthy because someone checks the hinges before the minister arrives. I shook hands with the kitchen brigade, spoke to the pastry chef, adjusted a lamp in the library because it tilted 3 degrees to the left, and no one but me seemed bothered by it. Ivana kissed my cheek and murmured, "Everything is in place." Petra stood near the back staircase in a charcoal suit, looking like someone's elegant mistake. 2 financial crimes officers, invited quietly on the basis of documents already provided, waited elsewhere in the building. Not hidden, merely unnecessary until they became necessary. Lena made her entrance at 7:15. There's no point pretending I felt nothing when I saw her. She was still beautiful. Beauty is not moral. That is one of its privileges. The green dress was silk, severe at the shoulders, softer at the waist. Emerald earrings, hair pinned high, composed. She crossed the ballroom greeting donors, touching sleeves, accepting admiration with precisely the right degree of reluctance. Tomas followed 10 minutes later in black tie, smiling the smile of a man who believed the next chapter had already been signed. Daniel arrived with Ava, his fiancée, daughter of a banker whose institution had once considered the Aurelia too sentimental to lend against, until Lena convinced them history could be monetized if wrapped in tasteful language. Ava was kind, intelligent, and had the misfortune to walk into our family at the exact moment it was becoming educational. At 8:30, dinner ended. At 9, the speeches began. The mayor went first. Then a cultural attaché who had never stayed in a hotel room he paid for himself. Then Lena. She took the stage to warm applause and held the room in less than 30 seconds. Some talents survive even after the heart using them has altered beyond recognition. She spoke about legacy, about the building enduring empire, occupation, ideology, flood, restitution, reinvention. About our daughter, though she did not say Clara's name. About grief teaching institutions to become more generous. About me. For a moment, listening to her, I understood how easy it is to be deceived by fluency. She could still describe our life as if she respected it. Then her tone shifted by half a degree. "As many of you know," she said, "Elias has carried this house for decades with extraordinary devotion. But devotion is not the same thing as immortality." Some polite laughter. I looked at my hands. Steady. "In recent months," she went on, "our family has been discussing the future of the Aurelia with the seriousness it deserves. Preservation sometimes requires transition. Strength sometimes means letting the next generation, and those prepared to guide it, step forward." There it was. A few heads turned toward Thomas. He lowered his eyes modestly. An old trick. Invite the room to promote you so you never appear to request it. Lena smiled into the light. "Tonight is not an ending," she said. "It is an evolution." And I am proud to say that with Elias's blessing, a new leadership structure will be introduced before the year closes. one that protects the Aurelia's future while embracing the opportunities ahead. Applause. Not thunderous. Enough. Then she said, "Thomas." He stood, and I remained seated. That was when the room first understood something was wrong. Thomas had prepared his face carefully. Concern, gratitude, a little filial humility toward a brother he was about to bury in public. He walked to the stage, kissed Lena lightly on the cheek as if no one would notice the intimacy of people who had forgotten where their bodies ended in relation to one another, and took the microphone. "I would never have chosen to speak before Elias on a night like this," he began. "A lie should at least have the courage to arrive naked. But leadership means accepting difficult responsibilities. My brother built this house. No one can replace that. What we can do is honor it by ensuring the Aurelia remains viable in a changing world." Viable, that was the word. The sanitized knife. He spoke about capital requirements, modernization, adaptive use, strategic realignment. He spoke about the need to preserve heritage through partnership. He used Daniel's renderings on the projection screen behind him without Daniel's permission. Stripped of full labels, elegant apartments, private terraces, legacy residences within the Aurelia estate. The room leaned toward the future because wealthy people always do when it is presented with enough glass. I turned and looked at my son. He was watching Thomas with such complete stillness that only someone who had raised him would have recognized the force required. Then Thomas made his mistake. "In the coming weeks," he said, "subject to final signature and board confirmation, ownership and management will transition into a structure that reflects both family continuity and commercial reality." Ownership, not stewardship, not management. Ownership. He had reached too far. Ambition does that. It makes men greedy not only for outcomes, but for vocabulary. I stood. No one stopped applauding immediately. People rarely understand they are witnessing the wrong ending until the protagonist changes posture. I buttoned my jacket, walked to the stage, took the stairs slowly enough to suggest age and quickly enough to suggest intention. Lena stepped back half a pace. Tomas did not. He still believed this could be managed. "Elias," Lena said softly into her microphone, a private warning disguised as public tenderness. "You don't need to." "I do," I said. I took the microphone from Thomas. The room settled. Glassware stopped. Even the quartet near the windows had the sense to become decorative. "I have no objection," I said, "to transition." My voice carried well in that room. I had designed the acoustics myself 15 years earlier, after enduring one charity auction too many conducted by men who mistook volume for authority. "In fact," I went on, "I arranged one." There was a murmur. Lena's face remained smooth, but only because she had practiced smoothness until it became a second language. "I have listened tonight," I said, "to speeches about legacy, evolution, and viability. All good words, polished words, safe words, the kind people use when they need to move a knife through a family without staining the tablecloth." A few people looked down at their plates. "Good. Shame needs somewhere to sit." "I would like," I said, "to be less polished." I nodded once toward the control booth. The projection screen changed. Gone were Daniel's bright residential renderings. In their place appeared a dry company registry extract. Vltava Heritage Development. Dates, ownership percentages, proxy signatures, Hanna Kralova's name, a second screen, internal payment flows, a third, consulting invoices tied to shell entities, a fourth. My signature on a vendor authorization, followed by a forensic comparison marked in red where the hand that copied mine had pushed too hard on the downstroke. I heard someone exhale sharply near the front. Tomas turned toward me then, not with panic, not yet, but with disbelief. He was still calculating whether indignation could save him. "What is this?" he asked, almost laughing. "Documentation," I said. Lena's eyes flicked once toward the back of the room. She was searching for exits now, not physically, narratively. I did not let her find one. "For the last several months," I said, "my brother and my wife have been preparing a redevelopment plan through shell entities designed to pressure this hotel into a distressed transition. Some of you were approached as potential partners. Some of you were misled into reviewing concept material you should never have seen. My son's firm was used without informed consent. False invoices were issued. Contracts were rerouted. My signature was forged." The room made that low collective sound human beings make when they realize scandal has crossed the boundary from rumor into administration. Tomas stepped closer to me. "You're ill," he said quietly, though the microphone caught enough of it. "You don't understand what you're presenting. There are insults that wound and insults that confirm." I looked at him. "No," I said. "You were counting on that." The screen changed again. Not messages. I had no interest in humiliating myself with bedroom evidence. Betrayal is degrading enough without forcing it to perform. Instead, I showed what mattered. Keycard logs from the rented Compa apartment paid via the same proxy entity as the shell company. Meeting schedules cross-referenced with lender outreach. Correspondence in Lena's language discussing the timing of the gala and Daniel's predictable adjustment. That line appeared on the screen alone for one silent second. Daniel will adjust. He always does. My son stood up so abruptly his chair scraped the floor. He did not speak. He did not need to. There are moments when silence comes from the deepest surviving part of dignity. Lena turned toward him instinctively. "Daniel," she said. The one person in the room she might still have reached, and even then only if she had not tried to use his name like a bandage applied after the bone has already set crooked. He looked at her with a face I hope never to see on him again. "Don't," he said. That single word ended more than her sentence. I went on. "You wanted a transition," I said. "Here's the truth of it. 3 days ago, my controlling shares in the Aurelia were transferred into an irrevocable employee and preservation trust. The documents are filed. The city has acknowledged them. The supervisory structure takes effect tonight. This building cannot be sold, converted, or leveraged through the arrangement you designed. There will be no ownership transition to Vltava Heritage Development, because Vltava Heritage Development will never touch this house." The room was very still. Tomas's face changed first. Not to shame. Men like him rarely arrive there so quickly. To emptiness. He had built months of certainty on the assumption that I would fight the wrong war, that I would defend my authority, my marriage, my pride. Instead, I had removed the object he wanted most from the board entirely. Lena, on the other hand, went paler with each sentence because she understood the deeper loss. Not money. Control of narrative. She had gambled on explaining me to the world before I explained her to it. Petra moved then, not hurriedly, just enough to be seen. 2 officers approached from the rear at the same measured pace. Financial crimes rarely requires sprinting. By the time people understand the danger, the doors are already administrative. Tomas found his voice before he found wisdom. "This is absurd," he said. "A family dispute dressed up as fraud." Petra answered from the side of the stage. "The complaint has already been filed," she said, "with evidence." He turned toward her, and for the first time all evening lost the smoothness he had mistaken for invincibility. Lena stepped toward me then. Not toward the officers, toward me. "You should have done this privately," she said. "There are sentences that reveal everything, because they make no moral distinction between the crime and the inconvenience of being seen committing it." I met her eyes. "You stopped being entitled to privacy," I said, "when you used my son, my name, and my dead daughter's hotel to build a life behind my back." It was the first time I had referred to the Aurelia as Clara's. In my mind, it had always become partly hers after we lost her, because grief turns property into shrine whether you want it to or not. Lena's mouth moved, but nothing useful came out. Perhaps that sounds cruel. It was. Revenge that costs nothing is fantasy. Mine cost me the final version of the woman I had loved. But by then, the cost had already been paid over months of reading her choices in folders with legal tabs. The officers asked Tomas to come with them. He refused in the theatrical way weak men often do, by insisting on respect in the exact hour they discover they no longer inspire it. One officer placed a hand lightly at his elbow. The gesture was almost intimate. Tomas looked at me as if even now brotherhood might override evidence. I gave him nothing. He left. No scene. No wrestling. No shattered glass. Just a man in formal wear walking through a ballroom full of witnesses who had finished applauding him 15 minutes earlier. Lena remained on stage. No one came to stand beside her. That detail mattered more than anything I said. Not because the room was noble, rooms are seldom noble, but people with money and influence have excellent instincts for structural collapse. Once they understood which beam had cracked, they moved their weight elsewhere. I turned off the microphone. Then I faced the room one last time. "The Aurelia will continue," I said, "with people who understand the difference between preserving a house and stripping it politely. The evening is over. Thank you for coming." I walked off the stage. No one tried to stop me. I did not go to the bar, though I wanted something hard enough to erase the taste of silk and old lies. I did not go after Lena. I did not look for Tomas. I went where I always went when the hotel became too full of performance. The service corridor behind the kitchen. The tiles there were still the old ones. White, cracked near the boiler room. A place beneath the building's vanity. I leaned against the wall and closed my eyes. My hands had begun shaking only after the work was done. That is another thing people misunderstand about composure. It is not the absence of feeling, it is delayed feeling. Interest collected later. Daniel found me there. He stood a few feet away for a moment before speaking. I could hear the restraint in him, the effort it took not to become a child in a corridor where I had once tied his shoelaces before school. "Was there ever a point," he asked, "when she meant any of it?" I knew what he meant. The marriage, the family dinners, the birthdays, the way Lena had sat at the foot of his bed when he had pneumonia at 9, the way she had held Clara's scarf to her face for weeks after the funeral. The ordinary tendernesses that become suspect when larger betrayals are uncovered. "I don't know," I said. It was the only honest answer. He nodded once. His eyes were red but dry. "I'm sorry," he said. "For what?" "For believing them longer than I believed you." Children apologize for impossible things when they are hurt. So do fathers. I shook my head. You believed your mother, I said. That should not have been a mistake. He sat beside me on an overturned wine crate because dignity is limited and grief ignores upholstery. After a while, he said, Ava went home. Is she angry? No, just wise. That's useful in a wife. He almost smiled. We sat there for 10 minutes without speaking. The kitchen staff passed once, quietly, pretending not to see us. There is mercy in professional discretion when it is done by people who have watched you work for decades. Then Daniel asked, What happens now? I thought of legal proceedings, of newspapers, of Lena's lawyers, of the apartment on Kampa, of trustees' meetings, of all the ways one can win and still spend years paying for the shape of it. Now, I said, the building survives. He looked at me. And us. That took longer. We find out, I said. He nodded. It was enough for the hour we were in. Lena did not come home that night. There are sentences that would once have devastated me. That one simply took its place among the documented facts. She moved into the Kampa apartment for a month, then to Vienna, then somewhere else. We communicated through lawyers, then through silence. The divorce took 14 months and was conducted with the same elegance she brought to donor dinners. Precise, expensive, bloodless in appearance. I would be lying if I said her absence made the apartment easier to inhabit. Rooms do not care who was right. They only remember where bodies used to turn instinctively toward one another in the dark. Tomas was charged, not only because of me. Once investigators opened the shell entities, they found enough additional fraud to satisfy even the state's natural laziness. He sent me one letter from Ramond, 3 pages explaining pressure, inevitability, resentment, my failures as a brother, our father's preferences, Lena's influence, market realities. There was one line in it worth keeping. You always made people choose between your standards and your affection. I've thought about that line often. It is possible he meant it as accusation. It may also have been the closest he ever came to telling the truth. I did expect too much from men who preferred to be loved for less. But standards are not cruelty merely because they reveal who resents them. Daniel withdrew his firm publicly from all Aurelia-associated work and endured a humiliating week in the trade press before the full story made that humiliation irrelevant. He joined the supervisory board 6 months later. Not out of sentiment, but because he said someone had to make sure the next generation of opportunists wore worse shoes. That was the first joke he made after the gala. I loved him for it more than he knew. Ivana became chair with the authority of a woman who had waited 30 years for idiots to become official enough to remove. Staff morale improved almost offensively fast. It turns out buildings can sense when the wrong hands have left them. As for me, I stayed another year. Long enough to steady the structure. Long enough to make sure the trust worked in practice and not only on paper. Long enough to realize that victory, if that is what people insist on calling it, had changed the texture of the Aurelia for me. The ballroom remained beautiful. That was the problem. Beauty continued. Chandeliers still warmed the ceiling. The river still lied magnificently beyond the glass. Guests still arrived in cashmere and expectation. Weddings were still hosted. Toasts still made. Silver polished. Sheets changed. Lives performed at 10,000 crowns a night. Meanwhile, in one invisible seam of the building, my marriage had died under applause. So I left. Not dramatically. I did not hand over a ceremonial key or make a speech about seasons. I simply moved into the smaller apartment overlooking the embankment and began walking in the mornings without checking occupancy reports. The first week felt like amputation. The second felt like weather. After that, something quieter. I still visit the Aurelia twice a week. I sit with Ivana, review numbers, argue about maintenance, drink coffee too strong for my age. Sometimes Daniel joins us. Sometimes he brings Ava, who did become my daughter-in-law 2 years after the gala, though in a ceremony so small and private that no one gave a speech longer than a page. I appreciated that. People occasionally ask whether I regret doing it publicly. No, I regret needing to. There is a difference. If I had confronted them in a drawing room, Lena would have cried in exactly the right places. Tomas would have called me paranoid, exhausted, possessive, old. By morning, I would have become unstable in the story they told for me. The sales structure would have survived. Daniel would have doubted himself. The Aurelia would have entered the mouth of men who call dismemberment redevelopment. Truth sometimes needs witnesses because lies are so much more socially gifted. Do I regret the cruelty? Yes, but only in the way one regrets the knife used to cut away rot. Not because it was unnecessary, because it had to touch living tissue to save what remained. That is the part no one romantic tells you about revenge. It does not restore innocence. It confirms its death. It does not return the marriage, the brother, the ordinary past. It only prevents the theft from becoming official. Years have passed now. Lena sent one note last winter after hearing Daniel and Ava were expecting a child. It was brief, not apologetic, not manipulative either, which in its own way felt almost intimate after so much skillful performance. I hope he will be gentler than we were. No signature beyond her initial. I did not reply. Not from hatred. Hatred requires appetite, and I was tired of feeding her any portion of my interior life. I placed the note in a drawer with other documents from that period and went to buy a small wooden train for my grandson, who was born in March with Ava's eyes and Daniel's habit of staring at ceilings as if negotiating with them. Sometimes, when I hold him, I think about inheritance. Not money, not buildings, not shares, patterns. Silence mistaken for strength. Charm mistaken for love. Usefulness mistaken for loyalty. The old family crimes, elegant and repetitive. I would like to interrupt them here. That may be the closest thing to redemption available to men like me. A month ago, Daniel found, in one of my desk drawers, the brass service key from the old laundry entrance at the Aurelia. We stopped using it years ago when the lock was changed, but I had kept it out of superstition. He held it up and asked why I never threw useless things away. Because useless and finished aren't the same, I told him. He laughed and said that sounded like something I would have engraved on a tomb. Perhaps it does. Still, I kept the key. Not for the door. That door no longer exists. For the memory of understanding, too late but not fatally late, that a house is never betrayed all at once. First, a ledger is altered. Then, a room is repurposed in someone's mind. Then, language changes. Viable, strategic, evolution, family continuity. By the time the walls are touched, the real theft has already happened in the vocabulary. That is why I stood up when I did. Not because I was brave. Not because I was clean-hearted. Certainly not because I was above humiliation. I stood because I finally understood that if I remained seated, they would not only take the building, they would tell its story afterward. And some losses are survivable until someone else begins to narrate them. The Aurelia still stands. So do I. A little colder, a little quieter, less interested in being admired, much more interested in locks, structures, witness, and the small early sounds things make before they break. That is not wisdom, exactly, but it has kept the house alive. And in the end, that was the only revenge I trusted.